Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University. And today we are focusing our conversation on the new book, Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives, that Jim Steyer, who is joining us today, has authored. Jim is the CEO and co-founder of Common Sense Media, the author of this and multiple other books, and also a longstanding professor here at Stanford University. And we're also joined by two other authors in the book, Maricha Shake, who is the International Policy Director here at the Cyber Center. She is also an International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI, and before that was one of the top legislators in European Parliament focused on tech governance. And we're joined also by Renee DiResta, who is with us at the center also. She is the research manager at the Internet Observatory, is a fellow at Mozilla and the Truman National Security Project, and a term member at the Council of Foreign Relations. So really happy to be joined by all of you, especially in light of recent events. Have been really looking forward to hearing what everyone here has to say. Quickly, before we jump into things, for those who are less familiar with the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford, all of our research and teaching focuses on improving the governance of digital technologies and their impact on geopolitics, security, and democracy. We're home to about a half dozen programs, and all of our work is really intended to inform the policy agenda for governments, for tech companies, for civil society and academia globally, again, when it comes to these questions of how best to govern digital technologies. And today, as I said, we're focusing on the new book, Which Side of History, which really takes a broad look at the impact of tech on society, everything from democracy to race to our youth to society writ large. It has chapters from more than 48 authors, including Maricha and Renee, and a chapter authored by Jim himself, but also from Senator Mark Warner, from New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, from Ariana Huffington, from actor Sacha Baron Cohen, New York Times contributors Nick Kristof and Thomas Friedman, Chelsea Clinton, and a wide range of others. So before jumping into that discussion, I'll just quickly note a couple of the more provocative data points that stuck out for me as I was reading this book. I think we're all very familiar with how pervasive digital technologies are in our day-to-day life. But was surprised to see that on average, we are checking our phones 150 times a day, that we are spending, and this is a data point from another source, almost 7 hours a day online before the pandemic globally, with folks in Brazil and the Philippines spending closer to 10 hours online. And that according to a study, Jim, from your organization, from Common Sense Media in 2019, American teens were logging an average of 7.5 hours a day of screen time, not including school or homework. And this is pre-pandemic. So I am sort of mortified, given that I have young children, to hear what those stats are now, but I imagine that you, if anyone, may know. So the book looks, broadly at the usage of these technologies, and then of course also on their impact on society, with screen time correlating to increased anxiety, depression, senses of isolation, attention challenges. But also, of course, as we've experienced under the pandemic, a sense of connectivity and productivity that is, hard to imagine that we could have achieved, I think, without these technologies. It talks about the impact on democratic institutions, which I think, of course, are most salient for all of us, given the storming of the Capitol last week. It talks about, and actually has an entire section dedicated to the impact of technology on race, looking at facial recognition technologies and predictive algorithms that have been used in everything, I think most notoriously prison sentencing and housing loan applications. And then it even moves to talk about the impact of technologies on the workforce, noting that tech and AI will impact nearly half of all jobs worldwide over the next 2 decades. That one of your chapters notes that more than 50% of all employees will require some reskilling by just 2022. And perhaps most poignantly for me, that's with young children, and I know Renee, probably for you as well, that 65% of children entering primary school today will have jobs in categories that don't exist yet. So the book, it really covers a lot of territory. So today, would love to start, Jim, with you and just hear 5 to 10 minutes of remarks on what inspired you to pull this together and what you found to be most surprising or important when you pulled these almost 50 chapters together. Then Renee, would love to turn to you. Your chapter spoke to this concern around bespoke realities and the sort of cult phenomenon that is taking place online. So would love to hear your thoughts on that, and also just what you have been observing after the events of last week. And then Maricha, would love last to turn to you. You spoke a lot about policy interventions that may be warranted here, and in particular, the need for greater algorithmic transparency. So would love to hear your thoughts on the huge moves that have been taken by tech companies in the last few days. And then we'll save about half an hour for Q&A. And so there is a Q&A function. If everyone in the audience wants to ask any questions, feel free to enter them as we go. And there's an upvoting function as well. And then I'll go ahead and moderate that last half hour, and we'll try to focus on the ones that get more upvotes. But with that, Jim, let me turn it over to you. And thanks again for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's great to be here with Renee and Maricha. And it's great to be here as a Stanford professor. It's basically the reason I did the book. This is my third big book on the impact of media and tech on society. And I am the CEO and founder of Common Sense Media. So we're the biggest kids media and kids advocacy group in the United States, and really a leading global tech advocacy organization. The reason that I wrote the book, I mean, part of it, Kelly, you mentioned your own kids and Renee's kids. That is what we do for a living at Common Sense. We look at the impact of media and technology on kids, but on society. And quite frankly, we saw this coming. And I think that it's interesting because the person who worked most closely with me on the book is a guy named Bruce Reed, who for the last 3.5 years was my closest policy colleague at Common Sense Media. Both Maricha and Renee met with him during times, for example, when we were writing the California Consumer Privacy Act in 2018. Bruce is now the Deputy Chief of Staff to Joe Biden, and along with Ron Klain, is running the government and overseeing tech policy. So this is a very good thing for us. And honestly, about 2 years ago, I was sitting with Bruce and said, look, this is in 2020. I knew he was going to work for Biden because he was Biden's former chief of staff. I did not know Joe Biden would get elected president. But what seemed clear to me at that point was, number one, technology is reshaping all of our lives. Number two, it was having an incredible impact on our political discourse and on our democracy, which you don't necessarily think of as kids' issues. But in terms of discussions I've had with colleagues like Renee and Maricha and others, it's a role that we feel at Common Sense, given the scale of the organization, we should talk about. And the third thing is, at the fundamental level for me, we work, and in the last week, I'm going to talk about this in a second, we have been working with the CEOs of all the major tech companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, and others, and obviously YouTube being a subset of Google, about their impact on society. And we are their biggest critic, but we also work with them. But the fundamental question I think we need to ask, they are the 5 largest companies now in the United States, and they have a degree of concentration of power and wealth that I think is unparalleled in American history, even if you look back to the Gilded Age. So the title, Which Side of History, is actually aimed at the major media and tech companies in the United States and globally, which is really asking them, you are shaping so much of our lives, whether it is kids' lives, mental health issues that you referred to, whether it is our democracy, et cetera. Which side of history do you want to be on? Because you're going to be on one or the other. And some of you, in our opinion, are not on the right side of history. And then rather than me writing the book myself, as I've done with prior books that I've written, I wanted to get my smartest, most talented colleagues, people who are way smarter than me, people like Renee and Maricha, to contribute chapters. So the idea was to force the question, and it was also to raise the issue of the impact of technology on democracy. And as you mentioned, Kelly, as we saw with the invasion of the Capitol last week by a mob that was incited by the President of the United States, but whose messages were amplified on massive social media platforms, who basically created a cult. It'll be interesting to see what Renee says about her piece. Is called Cult 2.0. Basically a cult of personality around Donald Trump that led to the events of the past week. It's interesting to say what responsibility these platforms. This is exactly what I've worked on for the last week since everything exploded on Wednesday. But the bottom line is, The idea was to get the smartest people that we knew to write about the impact of tech and what we should do about it. So a few points in general about it. Number one, the issues are very important in terms of everybody's life. You mentioned, for example, that Kelly, that at right now that mental health is a big deal. So I would tell you that obviously we're all focused on misinformation, disinformation that's been spread by the platforms, tech platforms and social media platforms. But you mentioned mental health. That's an incredibly important issue as well. As I'm going to mention in a second, there are no rules of the road really regarding content moderation and the amplification of lies, including the big lie Trump and his colleagues have told about the fact that the election was stolen. There is much new research that needs to be done in not just democracy, but also the stuff that Marisha will talk about in terms of transparency and reclaiming democracy. And from a kid's standpoint, which is our day job at Common Sense, what is the impact of the pandemic, for example, on their education, along with their mental and social and emotional health? So incredibly important issues out there. And the idea behind the book was to get the smartest people we knew with different perspectives to write about it. And so happy to answer questions about any of that. Big picture, I think we're at a seminal moment for global society when it comes to tech for several reasons. One, and by the way, the events of the last week have brought this into clear focus. Last week would not have happened if it weren't for the amplification of Donald Trump's messages on tech platforms, and if the right-wing white supremacist types who stormed the Capitol hadn't organized on Facebook and Parler and Gab and the other platforms. So we are at a seminal moment here in the United States and globally. And I would suggest to you, we could have a much longer than an hour discussion, that as the leading advocacy group on this issue at the federal level and in California, and Marisha can talk very much about global and EU advocacy since she's a former MP and very important leader in Europe on these issues. I think there are four frames that I would like to frame you from an advocate for the audience from an advocacy standpoint where we're going to be working this year and next year, where I think there will be a fundamental regulatory and legislative opportunity to change things. Because until now, there's been essentially no regulation at the federal level in the United States in 20 years. It's really only happened in California via the Consumer Privacy Act that we passed, Prop 24 that we passed in November, and other legislation we've done in California. So the framework is as follows. One, I think there's going to be a huge set of legislation and discussion about platform accountability. Now, I wrote a piece with Bruce Reed, with the aforementioned Bruce Reed, who's now overseeing much of the Biden administration, about Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act of 1996, which has been the get out of jail free card for all of the big tech and social media platforms. It's essentially meant that they are completely not liable for the content in their platforms. So one big issue is platform accountability, and I'm sure we can talk about that. Renee knows that issue well. Marisha knows that issue well. The second big thing I would say is the issue of bigness and antitrust. So one of my colleagues who works as an advisor to Common Sense and also has a great piece in the book, Tim Wu, a Columbia professor, one of the great experts on antitrust. We worked together with Tim last year and the state AGs to help develop an antitrust case against Facebook, which was announced by the state AGs a month ago, calling for the divestiture by Facebook of Instagram and WhatsApp. So I think the second big issue after platform accountability that we're going to see as a society from a policy standpoint will be antitrust and the sheer bigness of the big companies. The third issue is privacy. When we were doing the CCPA, the California Privacy Act, Marisha, I remember you coming to our office in San Francisco, and Marisha was one of the key people in Europe doing GDPR, the European privacy law. And we learned a ton from Marisha at that time and some of her colleagues in the EU about how to craft a United States law that would be similar to the European privacy law, given that the Europeans were ahead of us. So privacy is the other really big area the third big area that we'll focus on. And fourth is what I would call a tech equity. And I would give you the example of the digital divide. You mentioned the fact that our kids have been going to school in the pandemic at home and using devices and screens and in order to go to class. Well, 17 million kids in the United States in the middle of last year did not have adequate devices or connectivity to actually be able to go to school in a distance learning format. That's called the digital divide. So the fourth big area that I think we have to discuss as a society and move on at the industry level, but also, quite honestly, at the advocacy, federal legislative level, and I do think that will happen in the stimulus bill that you're about to see, because there's going to be a new stimulus bill from the incoming Biden administration, will be closing the digital divide, making sure that every family, every kid has access to technology, because jobs are changing. Everything today is done on tech platforms, even for Luddites like myself. And so at the end of the day, that needs to be shared equitably, and everyone needs to have the same opportunity. So bottom line, it's a seminal moment for American society and the globe to deal with the fundamental question of which side of history are the tech companies going to be on, and are we going to shape the kind of future that will benefit our kids, our families, our employees, and fundamentally our democratic institutions and norms, which, as we've all seen, have been under attack in the last week and actually over the past few years. So I'm delighted to be here. I'd love to hear from Renee and Marisha, and very psyched to hear the questions. But thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Renee, do you want to jump in now and speak both to your chapter, but also just observations from the last week?
Sure. So I think my chapter and the events of last week actually kind of unfortunately dovetail quite nicely. So I wrote an essay 2.5 years ago, was actually the initial draft, called Cult 2.0, asking the question, what is it, what are the names, what can we name this phenomenon of unreality, of bespoke realities in which people are being sorted in a sense, or nudged into particular spaces that don't necessarily adhere to the kind of broader consensus reality that most of us live in. And so I had been studying anti-vaccine activists for about 3 years by that point. And as Q became a thing, much like kind of a repetition of the phenomenon that I had observed when Pizzagate briefly became a thing, was that I began to get recommendations to join Q groups. And that was mostly on Facebook, but the content was everywhere. So if I engaged with any of the conspiratorial content I watched on YouTube, I would get Q videos. If I would see it on Twitter. It was what was interesting about it, though, is that it seemed to be growing a lot faster. Pizzagate, in a sense, was the conspiracy that there was this, that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of the basement of a pizza place in Washington, D.C. So that's, pretty far afield. But then QAnon was even more far afield. There was this idea that there was a, quote, Q clearance patriot who was, revealing the truths of the government, the president's existential battle with a deep state cabal. And he was revealing these truths via missives on 4chan, which then became 8chan and 8kun and so on and so forth. What was remarkable about them, though, is that people were joining these groups. And at first I wondered if this was just a phenomenon of, hey, here's something interesting and novel, and people are engaging with it. But then you started to see it really everywhere. And it began to manifest in the real world too. You'd see people wearing Q merchandise. There became a huge kind of Q signaling merchandise content all over Amazon. And if you engaged with one piece of it, you were just getting it emailed to you constantly, come back and buy this thing that you looked at. And you would see people showing up to Trump rallies holding Q signs. Q sent me. There were a lot of these. It became pretty clear that this was really filling a need for people, that there were a lot of people who were joining these communities who saw themselves as researchers, kind of trying to unravel the, riddles that the individual posting as Q spoke in. And so what I started wondering was, at what point does this become less of an online community and more like a cult, right? There's this complete, because what started to happen with these people is you would see their family members also beginning to write about how they had effectively lost people to this community. They were no longer occupying the same reality. All of a sudden, they were obsessed with not only the Q conspiracy, but Q became this OmniConspiracy, where it began through recommendation engine cross-pollination, honestly, as the same way I was seeing the Q content because of my engagement with anti-vaccine content, Q became very anti-vaccine because anti-vaccine folks joined those communities. The content was pushed out to people who had particular opinions, far right opinions about government. They became part of the community. Flat earthers, chemtrailers, you name it. The recommendation engine became a kind of conspiracy correlation matrix where if you were interested in one kind of conspiracy, it was going to show you all of these others. But what was distinct about Q was that it required a kind of belief in this figure, and it was really tearing people away from their families, whereas most of these other smaller, if you will, conspiracies, less immersive conspiracies, hadn't had quite that effect. So I started reaching out to people who knew something about cults because I am not a cult expert, and I wondered if I was overreacting, if they would say no, this isn't, this doesn't meet the criteria for being a cult. But surprisingly, they were like, no, this is a cult. And so the folks who were watching, Cult Dynamics back in 2018 were observing this as well. So to draw the through line to the present, there were three groups that were at the Capitol on Wednesday, right? There were mainstream Trump supporters, just people who, passionate followers of the president. There were the extremists, so the outright militia and white supremacist organizations, and the sort of avowed extremists who were looking for an opportunity to engage in violence. And then there were the Q people. And again, as you saw perhaps in the footage, there's a lot of, this is kind of a Venn diagram. There's some overlap between, those three communities, but you might have seen that some of the first folks into the building were wearing Q t-shirts or had Q merchandise on, and so this group had been observed to be growing kind of more and more radical by people who studied QAnon specifically. And I think the FBI had weighed in and said, this is getting a little bit off the rails here. And when that happened in 2019, the social platforms began to take steps to crack down on QAnon presence on their platform. So first, they removed it from the recommendation engine, which was something that that I'd been advocating for in 2018, saying, hey, maybe we should rethink what we recommend. Maybe even if it stays on the platform, we don't recommend it. There's a lot of different areas where we can maintain freedom of expression without, inadvertently recruiting people into cults. Low bar. And then the dynamic there, though, was that when the groups began to come down in 2019, late 2019, the problem is that's kind of shutting the barn door after the horse has fled, right? You've built demand at this point, you've built the networks, and so you've created the community. The community is going to continue to persist, even if you take down the group all of a sudden. And what's more, the act of taking down the group triggers deep, aggrievement around censorship, around, viewpoint persecution. So there are a lot of different ways in which those takedowns are processed. And now we're at the point where, the groups used the affordances of social platforms to grow a networked movement. This is a thing that social platforms are very, very effective for, regardless of what the networked movement is. So there was not a whole lot of nuance, We'd seen this before in early 2015 with ISIS. Also, you could grow a terrorist organization or you could grow a positive social movement, and the affordances were the same. It was, the question became, how do we decide which groups are harmful versus which groups are not? And that was a deeply uncomfortable conversation to have because it suggested, the risk of potentially censoring based on a viewpoint or a particular political point of view. As it came, as this story progressed, as the Q groups became more and more prone to extremist rhetoric, that was what finally precipitated those takedowns. So I think where we are today, though, is now we're at the point where those groups have been pushed into darker spaces with even less moderation. And I think the thing that I'll kind of leave us with that kind of refers back to something Jim said, we're going to see trade-offs now. We're going to see trade-offs between bigness and smallness, right? So as much as we want to see, for certain reasons, the anti-monopoly action on the platforms, what that is going to do is that smallness, that decentralization means that there's going to be a rise of these alt platforms. And we've already seen this with Parler, Gab, Telegram's actually been around since 2015. That's where ISIS went when they got kicked off of Twitter. But so we're going to see that fragmentation happen, which means that if you're looking for extremist groups, in the short term, their ability to recruit is going to be compromised a bit, right? Their, adherents are not going to find them quite so easily. But on the flip side, the people who stay, who go to the alt movements, to the alt platforms, are the ones who are much more deeply entrenched in the movement. So there's some interesting trade-offs on the radicalization front there. And then the other thing is the same thing with the privacy security trade-off. There's a lot of emphasis on privacy. For the vast majority of users, the privacy concerns are very significant, privacy, data gathering, et cetera. On the flip side, though, not a lot of carve-outs have been made for security research. And so if you do want to continue to have some visibility into extremism and radicalization, there does have to be some ability for researchers to study and understand these communities. And so those trade-offs between privacy and security, I think, are going to be the second big area that's going to come into focus as we move into the new administration and regulation.
Thanks, Renee. And I think that's exactly right. These trade-offs between privacy and security, between privacy and transparency, between free speech and an accurately informed public, between diversity and, quality discourse. I think that's one of the things that has become most salient in the last few years. It's just how many of these things do not have a clear answer because you're forced to choose between two important democratic priorities. So on that point, Maricha, would love to turn to you to speak both to, your chapter, which talked a lot about the need for greater transparency, which I agree is really a sort of an antecedent requirement in order to figure out and understand what's going on and come up with sensible solutions. And then would just love to hear more broadly your reactions from a European perspective, given how much has happened in the last week.
Thank you so much, Kelly, as well as Jim, Renee, and the whole team that made this webinar possible. It's kind of ironic, right, that we have this discussion 1 week after the mob attacked the Capitol, and then while the impeachment hearings are going on. I mean, it's like we're in history now, Jim, and it is really telling who's on which side. So you had a lot of foresight in starting this book, and I really appreciate all the work that you've done. I think for everyone who has been working on this, a lot of their worst fears have now become a reality. But for a lot of Americans, maybe for the first time, it has become undeniably clear how the lack of safeguards for democracy and the space that opened up in a very unregulated online environment filled up with more hate, polarization, and incitement to violence than people had hoped for or had noticed while they were looking elsewhere on the internet. And I think what it has also shown is the power of platform companies to make very far-reaching decisions. So let me say a few words about that, but I really look forward to the Q&A, so I'll try not to be too long. It's ironic also, by the way, that it's been 10 years since the start of the Arab uprisings. Remember those pro-democracy demonstrations where the role of technology was perhaps inflated, but led to a promise and a lot of marketing slogans that actually access to the internet and new technologies would almost democratize as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And clearly the downsides were hidden, or the notion of systematic surveillance not mentioned. And we've now seen over and over again that this automatic self-fulfilling democratizing movement didn't happen, but that some fundamental structures, both in the media but also in power, were disrupted along with a number of economic sectors. And I think that for Americans, this problem was perhaps not as clear when it happened in other countries, but really hit home last week. But of course, there were tons of warnings, first and foremost by minority communities in the US, civil rights organizations and civil society organizations, but also very, very clear incidents with violence, election related or not, in countries like Myanmar, the Philippines, Kenya, India, etc., where the role of tech platforms was quite clear. And I think there needs to be a lot of soul searching why those lessons never really hit home to the United States. But also from another point of view, I mean, having served in the European Parliament for 10 years and having tried to raise some of the reasons why we thought regulatory interventions were justified to safeguard rights and freedoms, for the longest time, whether it was in Washington or Silicon Valley, these concerns from Europeans were ridiculed, and no less than that. And so this whole boiling point that we've seen last week truly makes it clear that the online world is not a parallel universe. It's very much integrated into our real lives, and that this sort of dream where in an online world the best of humanity would automatically flourish has been completely pierced. And it's clear that the companies are feeling the heat. They took action before being really put under pressure by either civil rights groups or lawmakers. And I think that for them, the realization, or perhaps the knowledge of seeing all these hate groups and hateful messages, violent incitement, and organizing and mobilizing on their platforms had really hit home for them, the idea that they could also no longer hide behind sentences like, we don't want to be arbiters of truth. And Renee, you just talked about, the trade-offs between different interests. And I think that that's mostly missed. In the US, the lens has been so much the First Amendment and speech, and not how there's also other legitimate concerns, like the state needing to provide for public safety, or public health concerns for that matter, or the right to not be discriminated against, and so on. And so these kinds of trade-offs are hard. Nobody would deny that, but they're typically the territory of public policy. And the question is then, with what legitimacy has this huge agency, governance power over our public spaces and the rights and freedoms of people been outsourced to advertising companies? And I think too much of the discussion has now been about, is it good or is it bad that President Trump has been banned from certain platforms? But we must talk much more about the legitimacy question, and how principles of the rule of law, like oversight, accountability, equity of the application of rules, can apply in these online spaces as well. I do worry for knee-jerk incident responses, similar to what we saw after 9/11, where the pressure after a crisis was huge to do something, and where actually civil liberties were enormously eroded. And I think the US is still paying the price today. But we do need to see what we can do with the momentum that has opened up. I would suggest a focus away from the notion of regulating technology or the internet, but rather to focus on the preservation of democratic resiliency, non-discrimination principles, but also antitrust and things like that. And Kelly, you already mentioned it. In order to even be able to assess whether one's rights are at stake in a automated digital context, there needs to be more transparency and accountability. So I think that access to information for the proper individuals or groups, like regulators, journalists, lawmakers, civil society, etc., needs to be spelled out much more clearly in order to have a better insight into what is happening in these systems, algorithms, on platforms, etc., but also as a precondition for more oversight and accountability. And then on the part of accountability, it's important that oversight bodies have more and the proper knowledge, mandates, and resources to be able to then probe and assess, and where necessary to impose sanctions that actually bite. I think it's been quite painful to see some of the antitrust cases, which one, drag out for years, and then two, a fine that may be hefty for the average company of a couple of $1 billion, really doesn't actually hurt the platforms that are faced with these fines. So there have to be meaningful consequences to violations of the rule of law. And I hope that that's the momentum that we can get towards, even if I think it's a very tricky moment in terms of what could happen to civil liberties right now. I'll end there, and I'm happy to have more interaction from here on.
Great. Thanks, Maricha, and thanks everyone here. So we have quite a few questions. I'm going to do my best to moderate them, and I'm going to broadly group them into questions about the problem and then questions about potential solutions. And so starting first with the problem, a question about how now that many of these groups are moving into closed networks. And there was a great article that our colleagues at First Draft put out recently about the migration to Cloud Hub, to MeWe, to Rumble, that I think Signal is up something like 8x just in the last few days. So I want to start with a question about how do we think about tracking? And Renee, this might be a good one for you now that they are moving into these closed groups. And then there is a second question, which we can come to in a second, about just design principles and how do we bake better sort of democratic values into the design of technologies at the outset, rather than having to sort of clean up the mess on the back end. But Renee, thoughts on how, and I think we started first having these conversations, at the outset of 2020, when Mark Zuckerberg came in and said that, they're going to really elevate privacy. And we immediately, as a research community, thought, well, great, but then everything's going to move, underground, and how convenient won't that be for the PR team at Facebook? But how are you thinking about tracking this?
So there's a couple things here. First, there's we've seen groups migrate to Telegram before, and as I alluded to in earlier comments, it does make them more difficult to find. So if groups are communicating on encrypted or closed or hard to find platforms, then the challenge becomes you don't have very much visibility into them. Per your point, the platforms won't be able to use their AI to, which they use to kind of read, if you will, some of the private groups or the public groups won't be able to do that in the encrypted spaces. This is the problem people point to a lot with WhatsApp. So that problem is already here. And the question again is, do you gain more by, when people are pushed into those channels where they attract fewer adherents? The evidence from the deplatforming of ISIS suggests that it does have a positive impact in depressing recruitment and growing new members of the movement. When they're removed from highly visible spaces, people stop talking about them, they stop getting attention, people don't go looking for them anymore. On the flip side, though, it does make it harder to follow those communities, and that this becomes a challenge in extremist situations for law enforcement groups that have to that are tasked with understanding those dynamics.
Yeah, hence your point about the trade-offs between privacy and security as well. Any thoughts on designing, democratic values into tech design at the outset? And I know, just recently in the last few years, Stanford, MIT, and a couple of other universities have introduced classes, and Stanford even now has a hub on sort of tech ethics. Any thoughts on that before we turn to questions about solutions?
Yeah, we've got some work coming out now. Myself and Tobias Rose Stockwell, who's done some really great work on design, thinking through what can friction achieve. So for a while, again, beginning back in 2017, 2018, the conversation around could you potentially allow certain groups to persist but remove them from recommendations? There were also questions about, could we improve what went viral by rethinking certain affordances of virality? You saw Twitter make steps in that direction during this election, actually, when they ran that brief experiment to see if making people quote tweet rather than simply retweet reduced the prevalence or improved the discourse through the various metrics that they had laid out for that. What they ultimately found was that, interestingly, when that type of friction, having to actually type a sentence above your retweet, was introduced, people would type like a character, they would add an emoji and then they would just tweet it anyway. So they didn't feel that it really did enough to significantly improve the kind of quality of conversation in the way they'd hoped. But I think that there's still more research that they're doing on that front, and there are ways in which we can use friction to get to move people out of kind of reactive thinking into don't just hit the share button because you like the headline, but maybe engage with the content a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Twitter had found that it was one of their studies, it reduced shares by 30% once they actually asked people, had you read the articles? Jim, do you want to get in here?
I want to say two things. Since this is a Stanford audience, I want to say the following. One, it's so great that we have the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. But just like the platform, Stanford was so late to the game on this. And I, as a professor, have been saying this for years now. It's sort of pathetic. And Stanford deserved to really be criticized, in my opinion, for this. the university that I love and think is the best university in the United States. They did nothing to teach engineers, all these guys who went to work at all these big companies over the last 20 years. There were no classes about ethics. There was no classes about social responsibility. This has only come up in the last 2 years. So one thing I've said this to both MTL, the current president, and I used to say it to John Hennessy, my friend who's also the board chair at Google. What you think you can just raise engineers with libertarian ethoses who are going to go out and create products with no sense of ethics and social responsibility? So I think Stanford has to really look in the mirror and go, how did we, I'm sorry, I love my favorite university where I'm a professor. What did we do to create this? That's number one. Second, the idea is that there's a way to do this via machines and via technology fixes, Kelly, to me raises, sure, that's true, but that's again putting it on industry. You have to have a societal discussion. I think Marisha said it beautifully. There has to be a broader societal discussion and a series of policies set at the country level, at the national level. Europe is ahead of us on this, that raise these issues. The idea that it can be all solved via some technological fix, democracy can be solved via technology. Are we kidding ourselves? This is a fundamental challenge to society, and technology cannot solve all problems. So it's an interesting question, but the bigger one is, how do we as a society set rules of the road we should all work with?
I think, Jim, that's exactly right. I don't know if you recall, but that there was actually a persuasive technology lab at Stanford that was started in the late 90s to teach.
Contributing hugely to Facebook, and many of the kids who went to Facebook and started Instagram, and our friend Tristan Harris came out of that lab.
Right.
There was no ethical discussion at all about what they were doing in those classes. And shame on Stanford, and I will not name the professor, but we all know him well, who did not ever raise those issues with the students, because a lot of the things that they did ended up having many unforeseen consequences. But that's why we need this broader discussion that we're having right now.
That's exactly right. So now moving on to solutions. A question that has come up most, Marisha, is around how to have more of an international conversation about tech platform governance. I remember you were part of the Transatlantic Working Group on Content Moderation. NATO Stratcom does a lot on this, but what do you think about the opportunities and the current landscape of sort of international policy dialogue on these issues? And I will pair that with a question that came up much later around the risk of these platforms moving offshore. I mean, I remember when we hosted the Irish delegation, Marisha, and how many of these companies are headquartered there. But would love to hear your thoughts on the international landscape.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think broadly we've seen an interesting momentum building up even before January 6th. And I imagine this will only be accelerated between Joe Biden as a candidate, now president-elect, who has announced that he wants to organize a democracy summit as one of the first things that he wants to do. Because the realization that on the one hand, domestically within democratic societies, there are erosions and attacks on democracy going on. This is obviously counterintuitive at the first glance, but we all see it happening. In Europe, we see governments that don't respect the rule of law, that have a proactive and proud illiberal democracy agenda, which a lot of people note is a contradiction in terms, but this is still the path that they're taking. And so to ensure democratic resiliency, I think we need not only domestic work, but also certainly cooperation internationally, because I would say there are basically two threats to democracy that are most significant. One, in the context of digitization, one is that there's so much privatized power. And the other is obviously that authoritarian regimes with China in the lead have managed to really align technology with their political agenda and their political model. And so the vacuum lies in how we can ensure that democratic principles and the rule of law survive. And I think there's an urgent need to create a critical mass globally to create, standardized rules or notions of a level playing field as much as possible, where an enabling environment for rights protection, the right cybersecurity and trade, for example, can be created. So that's one brief comment. A lot more can be said, and I'll put in the chat an article that I wrote about this as well, if we have a chat. Yes. And then the risk of going offshore, I mean, it's kind of more of the same, right? As long as, and I know the EU is often seen as more proactive in regulation, but when you look at the whole scheme of all things that need to happen, I don't think the EU is that far along. I mean, just because it's done more than other global players doesn't mean it's done enough. And so you can see now, this morning it was reported in the Netherlands that this country is a tax haven, that Google made, I think, I don't know, 100 and something billion dollars and paid 25 million in taxes in the Netherlands. I mean, there's offshore happening already. And I don't know to be honest, if it would be that big of a loss for America, looking at how the fallout of job displacement, of greater inequality, of not paying into the public purse, even at a moment where stock prices are very high and the pressure to provide for unemployment benefits is enormous. I mean, this discussion, I would say, will become very similar within democratic societies, especially after the pandemic, where one of the few who gained were tech companies and almost everybody else loses. And so how to redistribute is going to be a huge question.
Thanks. Other thoughts on this? Or I think we can turn to a question to your point about redistributing on the data dividend that has been proposed, and would it make sense essentially to pay people for the technology, for the data that is being used, and whether this would have an impact on the disinformation problem? My sense is that it probably wouldn't, maybe tangentially, but I think Renee Alex has spoken well to the role that data plays in disinformation, that, without the capacity to micro-target, you end up with a sort of weapon without a target. And I've always appreciated his framing there. But does anyone have thoughts on the data dividend? Jim, do you want to jump in?
We actually introduced the term about a year and a half ago and gave it to Governor Newsom, who then put it into his State of the State speech. It literally called me like half an hour before the State of the State and said, "Hey, Jim, we're going to use the term data dividend, and we're going to promise it to everybody in California." And I actually said to him, "So Gavin, exactly what are you going to say?" He said, "I'm just going to announce the concept. We don't really know what we're going to do," which I actually think tells you the issue. So for years, this is interesting. I mean, Renee and Marisha will understand it. So we didn't call it the data dividend originally. I used to call it show me the money, which was, if you're going to take, because we were trying to make it clear to the public, right? The average citizen, not the average Stanford EE student or comp sci student, computer science student, but the average person, Luddite like me. The fact that basically Facebook, et cetera, are monetizing your personal information and selling it and making a ton of money. You are the product. We originally called we have a piece of legislation in California that we've never actually gotten up to a vote called You Are the Product, which is the data dividend. The idea is, if you're selling Marisha's data, she should get, 25 or 50 cents on the dollar of that, because Facebook is essentially taking her data and selling it to advertisers, just like they're selling it to everybody. This is really the advertising business model. So I think there's something there, but it's a complex one, because you also raise issues of equality and equity when you do the data dividend. But the reason I think it's worth having this discussion and potentially doing, if not California legislation, federal legislation, we actually introduced it, it just didn't get anywhere, and we had the governor behind it, is it's complicated to actually figure out how to do it right. And if you think about it, wealthy people's, Stanford graduates' information is more valuable than other people's. And so the fear was that it would be non-equitable and that it would be disproportionately favoring wealthy people. But I do think the idea that essentially the advertising business model that Facebook and Google in particular pursue, and is the basis of their extraordinary profits and their trillion-dollar valuations, is something that needs to be looked at in the overall context of the business model. And there's a piece in the book by Shoshana Zuboff, who is a professor at Harvard, also known as the USC of the East. And she is she wrote the book on surveillance capitalism, right? And she basically raises that issue from a sort of a business model standpoint. So I think it's a hugely important issue, Kelly, about whether or not there should be, if they're selling my data, your data, everybody's data, should we get a cut of it? That's the issue. It would make the public understand how the internet economy works very clearly, but it's really hard to legislate it.
Yeah, well, and of course, you see all of the recent challenges or the recent sort of outcry whenever tech companies were paying African American homeless people for, their photographs in order to feed that. So there are, I think, interesting challenges also in paying people for their.
It's a really complex issue. I don't know what Renee and Marisha think, but it's complex, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's also, if you have thoughts on that, Renee or Marisha, chime in, but I think there's also this question of whether tech should be regulated as a public interest utility. And I think here they mean social media in particular, but there have been so many conversations about where in the stack. I mean, we have net neutrality, right? But when you see Cloudflare or you see, Google kicking Parler off of their hosting, where in the stack do we have neutrality? How far up does that go? Does it reach the level of tech platforms? Do folks have thoughts on this? I mean, I have mine, but would be curious on yours.
Well, maybe just to start, I mean, I think what confuses this debate about regulating it as a public utility is that it may be perceived as if it is so viable, what do you call it, like necessary social media platforms, just like electricity. And that I don't think is the case. But the kind of regulation that we need is this notion of functional separation, where the gatekeeper, the platform, cannot use their proprietary position to deny access or to give priority to those who are providing the services. So you can take an example from how, for example, cable providers and content providers or electricity network operators and electricity providers have been treated in order to sort of separate the functions and separate the power that basically the gatekeeper, but in this context, the online gatekeeper, can use over those who rely on access to their platform. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And this can come through antitrust regulation, but maybe even further reaching, as you said, Kelly, interpretations of net neutrality or interoperability, which might, open up space for that. But I think we should not confuse regulating it as a utility with how vital it is, because I frankly think the world could live without social media platforms as well, not the same as electricity for that matter.
I think that's a great answer. I would just add two things. One, Marisha is far more articulate than I could be on this, but I agree with what Marisha said overall. But I think the word utility is a bad word. I'm going to repeat what I said in the opening. These are publishers. The big guys are publishers. They should be regulated in terms of the content moderation as publishers. And if they're considered utilities, that's what got us in trouble in the first place, is treating them like utilities. That's a bad word to use, in my opinion. I believe that the big players, certainly Facebook, Google, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, et cetera, they're the biggest publishers in the world now. Now, they're slightly different because it's largely user-generated content, but they need to be regulated like publishers are, just like ABC, NBC, Comcast, NPR, and the Washington Post are regulated. It's crazy, and the public would understand that, and to me, call them publishers, not utilities.
Great. So on that, let's move. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to save a minute for each of you to have final thoughts, in particular in light of recent events and your thoughts on the deplatforming that we've seen. But your point about publishers, let's move to CDA 230. There's been a lot of conversation, and I presume most joining this call know what CDA 230 is, but it is a mere 26 words introduced back in 1996 as part of the Community Decency Act, as part of a larger telecom act that basically does two things, but is primarily incentivized to immunize social media platforms from liability for content that is shared on their platforms, but at the same time, not to disincentivize them from moderating some of that content, so to allow them room to moderate, but essentially at their discretion, and to not hold them liable when they fail to do so. Thoughts on CDA 230?
It should be completely overhauled. The piece I have in the book, Which Side of History, here you go. Yeah. The piece in the book that I wrote with Bruce, actually Bruce wrote, yeah. I edited it. So Bruce is now going to be running the White House. So that's a good thing. Basically 230 has to be completely overhauled. That's the bottom line. And the truth is it's going to be a very complex discussion, but it's going to happen this year because you have people on both sides of the aisle. It was written in 1996, which is all you should. That was when Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers. And so that was the last time that they legislated, which makes it insane that is the law, the controlling law. And as I said earlier, to me, it is essentially a get out of jail free card for the large social media platforms. It needs fundamental overhaul, but it isn't simple to do it. But I will predict here that it will get done. It will get rewritten and fundamentally overhauled in 2021 at the congressional level and signed by President Biden.
And opponents of that, Jim, would say two things. One, that it may disincentivize, first of all, smaller platforms couldn't really exist without legal teams. So would it sort of institutionalize these monopolies even further? And second, you end up with them taking down, so much content around, trying to document war crimes being taken down as terrorist content and so forth. So we'd be curious, Renee, Maricha, also if you have thoughts on that, maybe Maricha in particular after NetzDG and what we've seen in Germany when, liability was increased so significantly and how that changed incentives there.
Yeah, I think this is a very poisoned discussion by now, because it is often portrayed as if there's either zero liability or 100% liability, and there is a world in between. And that's where I think we should focus. Not only because lawmakers are going to require it, and I think Jim is right that there's a lot of pressure on this liability exemption right now, but also because platform companies themselves have started to intervene. It is impossible for them to say, well, we're neutral and we're only bringing together supply and demand. COVID before January 6th dramatically changed this. And I think also in the EU, pressure to remove terrorist content and other illegal, but also harmful, and therefore not strictly speaking illegal content has been going on for a while now. And so I actually think from a rule of law point of view, principally, it's better if these definitions, but also criteria and processes for removal are spelled out. But of course, it doesn't mean that every overhaul will turn out well. And what happened in Germany, although I do think it has been, it's been criticized so much. It's almost, pointless to add to it. I think the idea was that there should be a period within which platforms act and otherwise are fine. But, the risk of platforms now becoming, overly ambitious all of a sudden to censor content without proper redress mechanisms and stuff like that was the trap, I guess, of this German law. But there's more going on. The UK has this online harms bill that's going to be introduced, which I think will be interesting. I'll be hosting an event shortly with Damian Collins about that as well. So there are movements, and I think fragmentation would be a problem. So if every country does their own thing, it doesn't help. This is typically a topic where I think democratic countries should work together. So even if there would be a federal level action in the US, I think it'd be even better if, for example, the US and the EU could come to agreements on where speech is free, and thankfully it is in our societies, but also where in very, very strict cases, there should be limitations, and particularly what process should be followed to properly ensure redress, no overreach, transparency, and all that.
Thank you, Maricha. So we are just about at time. Any final thoughts on this topic for all of you before I turn to upcoming events, including one that we are going to be hosting on the 22nd that will that will have experts from across the cyber policy on the topic of tech regulation after the events of last week. But final thoughts from each of you.
I just want to say thank you to Stanford and then turn it over to. I think it's great that the Cyber Policy Center is doing this. We could go on for 3 hours on these topics. And I'm glad, Maricha, I didn't know that you were going to do a thing with Damian, who I talked to yesterday about the UK online harms bill. But these are such critical issues. I'm so glad I made my criticism of Stanford earlier, and I stand by it. It's great that Stanford's finally dealing with this stuff. Where was Stanford for the past 15 years until the Cyber Policy Center started? And Rob and folks started teaching classes about this in the last year or two, because Stanford is a critical institution. So I just think the fundamental title of the book is still right. Which side of history are we all on? Are the tech companies on? Are our governments on? And because at the end of the day, it's our kids who are going to ask that question. And right now, it's an open question. And we're at this critical seminal moment. So the more we can work with you and the Stanford community on this, the better.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And thank you for writing this book and everyone here for showing up today. Renee and Maricha for your contributions there. Really have appreciated this and agree we could have 3-hour conversations on this and we actually do regularly. So it has been great. to get to work with all of you. So let's now turn to next steps. We have, I don't even think we have a slide about it yet because we are still in the process of pulling it together, but at 1 p.m. on January 22nd, we will have a meeting to talk about what happened in the Capitol. And then on the 27th, Maricha, you will be hosting a conversation about Europe's Digital Services Act. This is the biggest legislation coming out of Europe, and it is going to have huge implications, not just in Europe, but around the world. And so I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And then we will have a number of other events coming up that we will be posting on our website and sending out in our newsletter soon. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and Maricha and Renee for writing, and Jim for writing and pulling together this fantastic book. I hope everyone gets a copy because it covers so many important issues about how technology is impacting our society today. So thank you all and stay well.